The bar smelled like old stories, smoke, spilled beer, and a kind of stubborn grease that had soaked into the floorboards years ago. The lights were low and forgiving. The jukebox was coughing up a country song from a decade no one could remember. It was the sort of place where everyone pretended not to be alone. In a corner, framed photographs leaned on each other like veterans at a reunion. Faces frozen, dates stamped in sepia. A neon sign buzzed half a syllable. The pool table's felt had a history of arguments folded into it, and behind a counter scarred by service, the regulars had their places and their habits. Emily moved through that small world the way a practiced tide moves through a harbor. Quietly, predictably, necessary. Jeans, a white button-down with the cuff faintly frayed, hair tied back because there was no time for anything else. She did not ask for attention. She kept orders straight. She kept bills paid. She kept a photograph tucked in the inside pocket of her apron. A photo she looked at sometimes on breaks, then refolded and slid back away. People called her polite, efficient. That was the surface. Below it was a map of other things. A Marine Corps tattoo, faded but unmistakable, on her chest. An emblem she never drew eyes to and never talked about. The tattoo was not a decoration. It was a ledger, and ledger-keeping. It tracked a set of years and a set of choices. That night the door opened and brought with it the smell of oil and leather, and the kind of male energy that bunched itself up like a storm. They came in loud, half a dozen men with jackets that had seen better winters, boots that announced themselves, and a leader who moved like he expected people to make room. The leader's name, the regular who remarked later, was Rhett. He had tattoos like a map of his choices. He laughed in a way that wanted witnesses. He drank like he wanted to forget. And when he looked at Emily, the look was quick and sharp. Not curiosity so much as something hunting for a small and sensational moment. Emily kept to her rhythm. Pour, collect, smile. She had been taught to move without flinching, in training, in chaos. And that lesson was as helpful behind the bar as in other louder rooms. Her hands were steady. Her eyes scanned. She noticed the man at the end of the counter who always told a fishing story but this time didn't laugh. She noticed the retired mechanic who polished a glass, as if mending metal could fix loneliness. Rhett crossed the room and took the bar like a claim. His voice wanted center stage. When his jokes went cheap and leaned toward Emily, they were the kind of words that weigh more heavily for the listener than the speaker. She did not look up. Most people in the room understood the rules: ignore or risk being pulled in. But Rhett wanted proof of power, and when power is show, it wants spectacle. The motion was quick. A hand seized fabric, fingers found the collar, and the turt tore. It happened with an ugly, hungry sound. The bar inhaled. Someone released a laugh that was the wrong shape for the moment. Someone else cursed. There was a taste of fear and a flash of indignation in the air. When the shirt fell open, people expected the script they'd always seen. They expected shame. They expected an apology. They expected an end they could clap for. Instead, something steadier and heavier filled the space between them. Across Emily's chest, a tattoo sat like an accusation and an explanation at once. The United States Marine Corps emblem, bold, worn by time, with smaller ink beneath it, a unit number, a date, a name etched in piney, determined script. The room changed in a breath. Rhett's jaw loosened as if something had come unstuck. The bravado that had been a necklace suddenly slid off. He stepped back, the posture of a man who'd caught sight of a mirror that showed something he hadn't expected to own. Emily's movement was measured. She did not speak. She smoothed the torn fabric as if making it obedient again. Her breath, when it registered, was slow. The tattoo did not ask for applause. It held a record, 1-5, the digits of a battalion, and beside them a date, 03.2107. The kind of tiny detail that might mean nothing to a casual bar patron, but everything to someone who kept time by other people's campaigns. Someone at the counter, the retired mechanic, the one who knew the bar's bones, let out a sound that could have been a sob or a laugh, and the room tilted. A veteran in a dark jacket, who'd been nursing a beer, rose and touched the rim of his glass as though remembering a different kind of toast. Rhett's face changed slowly, like weather. For a moment, he looked like a man who'd been carrying around a question and suddenly realized he had been sitting on the answer. He stepped away from the table, his voice gone thin. He told his men to move, murmured words we couldn't hear, and they left in the shadow of the door. The storm passed, but its residue settled around the counter like dust. The next day, people talked in lower voices. The bar's rhythm shifted. Some said Emily had been in the Marines to escape a life of nothing. Others said she had been drawn there by an honest call to serve. The truth, as truths often are, had small edges. She'd enlisted at 19, not for glory, but as an exit. She'd been to places where sunrise arrived late, and fear had its own timetable. The tattoo was not a showy proclamation. It was a ledger of survival. In the days that followed, a rumor began to run through the small town like a spill of ink. The initials beneath the unit numbers, DH, and the date. People filled in the rest with guesses. Some said DH was a nickname. Others whispered it was a man's name who died under circumstances that made neighbors uncomfortable. An operation that went wrong. A dust-up in 2007 that had left questions. Emily kept working. She kept the photograph folded and tucked away. She kept bringing sandwiches to the drifter who slept on the porch when the nights were cold. She kept looking at the retired mechanic and the veteran by the window with a softness that asked nothing in return. But there were nights when her hands trembled as she refolded the photo. There were nights when a song could drop her into remembering, and she'd press her palms to the counter until the whiteness of them felt like control. She had learned to name the triggers and give them edges so they would not swallow her. She had learned how to keep living as if the present were something she could protect. Months rolled into patterns. The bikers didn't return. People left the bar with new manners. They would say thank you when Emily stepped by, sometimes with an awkwardness that felt sincere. Yet the question about that small script of ink sat in the room like a pressed leaf. Who was DH, and what had happened on 03.2107? One evening, toward closing, the retired mechanic, the one who kept the bar's inner workings humming, shuffled over and sat at the counter. For years, he'd fixed engines with hands that remembered torque as if it were a prayer. He polished his glass the way others might polish a memory. On the wood between them, he placed a folded scrap of paper, the edges soft from being opened before. Emily washed a glass and didn't look at the paper right away. When she finally reached for it, her fingers brushed the fold, and for an instant she closed her eyes. The room narrowed like a lens. The veteran by the window straightened. A young man who'd once come for peace sat frozen mid-sip.
The mechanic slid the scrap closer. "You kept me from throwing this out," he said, voice low. "Thought you ought to have it." Emily unfolded the paper. It was small, a single page of handwriting, careful and cramped. There were names, dates, a few terse sentences. At the bottom, someone had pressed a dog tag into the margin for safekeeping. On that dog tag, a name: Corporal D. Hayes. She looked up. The photograph in her pocket felt like an ember. Her voice was the shape of patience. "He was my friend. Danny Hayes. We were there. Something happened on 03/21/07. We were supposed to walk away and keep quiet. I couldn't. I couldn't let them bury it." The bar leaned forward. The veteran, who had touched his glass, said nothing. but his eyes had the same wet glitter a man gets when an old hurt finds a door. Emily folded the paper back into a smaller square and held it as if it could be lit. The retired mechanic cleared his throat. "Danny used to come here," he said. "Used to laugh. Sat where you do." He tapped the counter. "Something about him kept you all from being simple. He had a laugh like a clock." Emily nodded. "I buried him once, and I buried the rest of that night with him. But I kept one thing out of the ground." She reached behind the counter, and with hands that trembled in the way of someone handing over a sacred thing, she produced a small folded letter wrapped with string. This was his, and in it a name. At that moment, the door opened again. Everyone looked up. A man shuffled in, hat low, shoulders a little more bent than the photograph might have suggested. He moved to the counter and sat where he always sat. For years he had been the man who told the same fishing story, the town's slow-moving clock. No one thought much of him. He was a comfort of repetition. Emily's hand brushed the folded letter. She slid it across the counter without standing. The man who always told the fishing story looked at the envelope as if he had been punched. The paper's string came unwound like a hush. He opened the letter with fingers that had a map of years written into them. He read 3 lines, and his face rearranged itself, confusion, then recognition, then a kind of raw astonishment. He swallowed a sound. "Danny?" he asked. The word was small and policed with disbelief. The retired mechanic's hand covered his mouth. The veteran at the window set his glass down slowly. It was as if someone had pulled a curtain and a stage of a life they'd been reading suddenly had a name attached to it. The man, the one who always told the fishing story, looked up. He ran both hands over his face as if memory was a coat he was pulling on. "They told me," he began. "I thought I forgot. I thought they took it away." Emily's voice was quiet, threaded with the tiredness of someone who'd been keeping a fire for a long time. "You didn't die," she said simply. "We made sure you didn't die. The rest of it we couldn't fix, but we kept what we could keep." The room held a breath that turned into a sound, relief, disbelief, grief, forgiveness. Rhett's name rose in the memory of the barbered men who had left months ago. If a man had come looking for vengeance and found the person he'd blamed, perhaps that vengeance was the steam of unresolved sorrow. The mystery that made the town whisper, who was D.H., what happened on 03/21/07, unpeeled not into a tidy finish, but into a version of the truth that felt human. Denny Hayes had been one of them. He had been broken in ways that didn't make good headlines. He had been kept safe, relocated, given a small anonymity to survive. Emily had been one of the few who'd chosen to protect him rather than let the darker currents of that night swallow every witness. Outside, the streetlights blinked. Inside, the bar's hum resumed its old pattern, but with a new undertow. People spoke in softer tones. Some apologized without making a show of it. A man who had once reached for a cheap spectacle reached instead to hand a jacket to someone who shivered. Emily tucked the dog tag back into her pocket. Her shoulders steadied. The tattoo was still there, under the cotton, the small digits like a wound that had learned to be quiet. She had not wanted the spotlight. She had wanted truth, not for glory, but so someone could be spared the injustice of being erased. The lesson the night left behind wasn't neat. There was no sweeping moral, no perfect reconciliation. What there was a patchwork. A man who had been given a second chance at a life without headlines. A waitress who had carried a secret like a candle for years. A bar that had learned in small ways to treat its people with more care. If this moment touched you, if the hush of human things made your chest tighten, then remember, people carry histories they may not show. We can be quick to judge a small moment and miss the life behind it. We can also, if we choose, listen and hold out a quiet hand. Please like, subscribe, and share this story if it moved you. Tell us below which part of Emily's secret you felt most for: the keeping, the giving, or the slow unpeeling of truth. Your words might be the small, ordinary act that helps someone else stop carrying alone. Thank you for listening.